Hello and welcome to Building Brand Gravity. I'm Anne Green. I'm CEO here at GNS Business Communications, and I'm delighted to be joined today by a friend and a colleague and an amazing thinker and a woman that I really admire, Natalie Nixon. Welcome, Natalie.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So, Natalie, I'm not going to go through your whole bio because we're going to kind of draw it out as we talk. But I think what's really intriguing to start and sort of center our conversation is just thinking about the list of attributes and of your journey over the years. You are a dancer, you're an academic, you're a PhD, you're a professor, you're a speaker, you're an author, you're a design thinker, you run workshops. I mean, you've had such a broad career that we're going to get into. But one of the titles that I really love is The Creativity Whisperer, which is perfect for podcasts, The Creativity Whisperer. So, what is that is so intriguing. What does that mean and how did you come to this very intriguing moniker?
Well, that was a moniker given to me, and I've been highly flattered to be called that. And I love it because it captures my goal of conjuring out from people, especially who may not self-identify as creative, how absolutely creative their work is, their approach to their work. And it's my goal to really help people build their creative capacity. So, um, you know, often in the hallowed halls of Fortune 500, Fortune 100 companies, is not necessarily deemed appropriate to talk about creativity. Innovation is okay, but creativity not so much. And in the early years of starting and building figure eight thinking, I was called in many a time to help build a culture of innovation. And I quickly discerned that we were starting in the wrong place. We actually needed to start with creativity. The problem, of course, was that so many people only associate creativity with artists, with the field of design. And it was my perspective and something I've proven out through my research that the best and most innovative plumbers and engineers and scientists and attorneys and teachers and accountants and artists are super creative when they're, you know, I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later, but these dimensions of wonder and rigor, toggling through wonder and rigor is really important. But convincing people of that takes a bit of whispering.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's that breaking through barriers of perception. I mean, tell me more about that distinction that people have. They might think it's innovation, but they're missing the role that creativity plays there. How have you tried to, first of all, recognize that that was a tension or a dichotomy? And then how do you unpack that for people to say, hey, we got to get clear about what we're actually talking about here?
Well, first of all, there was no, very rarely within an organization, within a sector, is there a lingua franca about
Mm.
innovation. And what often happens is innovation theater or innovation becomes siloed. It becomes the room or the department where people get to, air quotes here, play with sticky notes all day, which is a bit insulting. And that's not exactly what's going on. Um, but then I had to really wrestle with thinking to myself, okay, if I'm going to be offering a critique of the way people are currently approaching innovation, I better come up with a pretty compelling
Mhm.
alternative. And so the way I think about innovation is that an innovation is an invention, a one-off, a conceptual one-off converted into scalable value.
Mm.
So how do you go from that
Mhm.
one-off to that scalable value? And that could be financial value, social value, cultural value. The converting factor, the conversion factor to go from that one off invention, pretty cool, to that scalable value is creativity. It's
Mm.
creativity that helps us to convert from that one off to that scalable value. So innovation is actually fueled by creativity. If we want to innovate in a sustainable and consistent manner, we have to build the creative capacity of ourselves as individuals, of our teams, and of our organizations.
It's interesting hearing you define that because one of the questions I had for you is why creativity as a lens or an organizing principle. And it sounds like for you, it's that you came to that understanding that that's a generative factor. I mean, creativity is always generative in its own ways, but am I right in thinking of it that way? That's because it's of its role in sort of catalyzing something that might be an idea into something larger, that became a lens for you. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. It is a catalyst. It's something that does not get, creativity actually loves constraints. it loves constraints on time, on budget, on people talent. So I never stop at the excuse of, well, we just don't have time, or we
Mm.
don't have the people talent. That's actually awesome. And we can all reflect back into moments in our lives, our careers, where it was in those moments, those chapters where we had such constraints that we were actually uber creative. And so, yeah, that idea of thinking about creativity as a catalyst is a real important inception point for me.
I love the idea. I want to come back to that creativity as constraint a little bit later because I think that's very important. And I think it's not, I do think there's a lot of misconceptions about what that creative space should be or is expected to be, especially in a corporate setting. I've been agency side and the corporate communications for over 30 years now. And so I've seen a lot of manifestations of, we're meeting to be creative right now, which is usually the B word, the brainstorm, which can be a much abused subject. But how did you, as I've said, you've had a very diverse journey of your own and very creative. How did you come to the place today where you have figure eight thinking, which is advisory, but also and as a speaker and as a writer and an author? I know you've written one book called The Creativity Leap. You're writing another now. How did you come to this place?
Well, it was very loopy.
It's a big question.
It was not a direct route. And to be honest with you, Anne, I committed to following the nudge. I
Mhm.
committed to following my heart and the intuition. So you hinted at my diverse slash loopy background. I have a background in cultural anthropology and the fashion industry and in education as a teacher and as a qualitative researcher, and literally every
Mm.
single work experience I have had has converged to give me the tools, the toolkit that's made figure eight thinking. And the way figure eight thinking came about was really, it started as a side hustle. I was a professor at the time. I was actually a professor for 16 years. The first 10 years, I taught the business of fashion. The last 6 years, I created and launched a strategic design MBA program. And our goal in launching the strategic design MBA program was to offer the best of business school meets the best of design school. So
Mm.
already you see my leaning towards hybrid thinking. We actually
Mhm.
called it the MBA for hybrid thinkers, but my leaning towards hybrid thinking and multidisciplinary approaches. But I gave a TEDx Philadelphia talk in 2014 where I was proclaiming that the future of work is jazz. And here's why and how. After giving that talk, I started getting invited into companies to help them essentially do
Mm.
that work of figuring out how do we become more improvisational in our approaches to building
Mm.
services and experiences and products. And I was facilitating, I was doing some consulting, I would speak here and there. I was still a full-time associate professor. And my husband, John, said, babe, this is becoming a thing. You should probably formalize it. And I was like, okay. So I created figure eight thinking totally as a side hustle. Interestingly, I originally wanted to call it only figure eight, but
Mm.
that LLC name was taken. And I'm so happy now that I tagged on the word thinking, because as it turns out, I'm a nerd, so thinking is pretty core to what I enjoy doing and
Mm.
how I spend a lot of my days and my time. But B, I think one of my superpowers is my ability to help people rethink, reframe the ways that they are thinking. And the reason that matters is that if you shift your mental model, that
Mhm.
begins to shift behaviors, which ultimately shifts culture. So it all starts with how we think. And that figure eight was really to connote the iterative process, the building out and then revisiting of an idea. So, but that's the background about how I got there. And really my background in fashion is where I bring in trends and foresight work. My background in cultural anthropology gave me and qualitative research gave me the ability to ask questions in a different way, get the worm's eye view. My role as a speaker, my background in dance as a teacher comes into play hugely. So I'm at a really magical place in my career and my work.
It's a lot of points of intersection. We talk
Hmm.
about intersectionality in many different ways. In the formal way it was originally intended, but now almost more metaphorically. Um, And the idea of hybrid thinking, we're in a hybrid world. We're understanding that notion of being hybrid in very practical, physical ways as we work in different spaces, as we navigate different spaces. So I love that idea of bringing that hybrid model of thinking. I think that's very evocative of the space that we're in right now. You know, it's an interesting construct.
It is, right? And it's not, I think we're a lot better at it than we sometimes give ourselves credit for if we
Mm,
just kind of let go of the constriction of how, frankly, we've been educated. You know, most of us have been educated to err on the side of what is the answer,
yeah.
what is a solution, not falling in love with the process. So, hybrid thinking, hybrid work becomes an opportunity to really fall in love with the process.
Yeah. One of my mantras as an organizational leader, the people are going to get sick of hearing in my role, is that
No.
two things can be true at one time. That
Yeah.
zero sum thinking, or especially us versus them thinking, that's another aspect of zero sum thinking, is really destructive. And there are times where things are very clear. This is this, that is that, fantastic. But if there's nuance, we need to live in the nuance, and there's dynamic tensions to be attended to. You know, there's going to
Yes.
be a push and pull, and multiple things can be true at one time. And I feel like that that really speaks to what you're saying, which is how we live in a world that's like that at a macro level, and not just our businesses or the nonprofits or the work that we do. Our lives, the geopolitical scene, the whole world around us is fraught with questions like that and tensions, and trying to figure out how we stay flexible in our thinking is important, I think.
You're right. And on a really, really macro and meta level, the need for
Mm.
flexibility and hybrid thinking is necessary now more than ever. We can
Yeah.
think to geopolitical issues,
Yeah.
to interpersonal concerns, to just where our various societies are growing. We need to be adopt and embrace that flexibility and hybridness.
So you've talked about organizations, and as you said earlier, that could be a nonprofit, it can be a Fortune 50 or 500, it could be really any type of organization. I've worked with many across my career over all these years, of all sizes. You talked about innovation as a potential pressure point of, oh, we're trying to break through and understand what that means. What are some of the other challenges or problems that organizations or individuals come to you to try to solve? Because there's a lot of different ways that I feel like the work you're doing and the thinking you bring to it can apply.
One that's become, I'm starting to see a pattern
Mm-hmm.
around in terms of the requests that I get is to normalize curiosity,
Hmm.
is to help us. And I, for example, I was hired by a major global law firm, by a C-suite team there to help them shift their thinking so that curiosity doesn't become punitive, but instead it is the beginning of discovery. And
Hmm.
that was an awesome engagement because, I'm married to an attorney. John is an attorney. He does that sexy law, that ERISA tax benefits law and
There you
executive
go.
comp, size 2 font documents, etc. He's
70
primarily
pages. Yeah,
70
exactly.
pages exactly. He's primarily executive compensation attorney now, but I saw so much creativity in the way he approaches his work. There's the wonder of, like, what's the
Hmm.
question we should be asking? Where do we need the plane to land? What is the need and the desire of the other side? And starting with that curiosity, but the rigor is knowing the law, knowing the regs, right? We have
Hmm.
those constraints which are useful. So building a culture of curiosity is a big deal in a world and in organizations where you hired probably some A-type personalities who got to where they are because they were really good at filling in the dots, answering the
Hmm.
question, coming up with a solution, an answer, a way of going forward. And then we realize that we work in markets and serve client needs that are highly ambiguous, are not predictive,
Hmm.
are constantly shifting. And so, part of my training in design thinking, the value of human centered innovation in design thinking is that it really values, if you think of the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule, we
Hmm.
should be spending 80% of our time and asking, did we even ask the right question? before we go running down this rabbit hole of assumptions, which is unnerving when you've got a timeline and budget and demands. But if you don't flip that script of the 80/20 rule, spending more time on the question framing, then you will inevitably incur all sorts of costs, tangible and intangible costs, by not spending time on that. So that's one area that's been extremely exciting to
Mm.
me. The idea that storied law firms and pretty, no offense to the attorneys out there, but I have some insight by being married to one. Law firms try to really operate on certain levels of predictability,
Yep.
but to be open to the ambiguity of question framing. And so what I took them through is everything from, what I call the taxonomy of questions, really understanding what questions are, the range of questions, divergent, convergent questions,
Mm.
taking them through, instead of brainstorming, question storming, and really diving into generating all sorts of questions around certain parameters. And then I love this charge from Warren Berger, my colleague and friend Warren Berger, who's the author of A More Beautiful Question. He calls himself a questionologist. He talks about how companies should have mission questions, not mission statements. Because if
Mm.
you have a mission question, right, it's much more organic. It can actually evolve with the growth of the company. The other area that I'm helping companies with is it's a kind of some variation on curiosity, but it's really about how do we see differently? How do we, in a visual artist world, it's about seeing the negative space, right? So if you're asked to draw a vase, you don't draw the matter of the vase, you're really drawing the outline of it. So you have that
Mm.
famous optical illusion. Is it a
Yep.
vase? Is it a woman's profile, right? That's the negative space exercise. So engaging in new ways of seeing is about being able to be much more experimental. It does start with asking new and different sorts of questions. It's about figuring out how about who we invite in on a
Mhm.
collaboration process, because when you collaborate with people who don't have your background, don't have your skill set, don't have your training, it opens up new ways of seeing in very exciting ways. And the third area that has been kind of a standard thing that I get invited to do is to build cultures of experimentation, which really starts with prototyping and not
Mm.
leaving prototyping to only the design team. But I've seen great prototyping happening in financial services and the healthcare sector. You can prototype services, experiences in addition to products, and you save so much time and money, and you get buy-in in building in cultures of prototyping.
That's really powerful. The curiosity piece, I think, is so critical. It's something that I've always talked about. People would say, even from a hiring perspective, if it's a young person, and said, what are you looking for? One of the first things, enthusiasm is one, but intellectual curiosity is another for me. And I pair intellectual because, and I want to get into your framework of wonder and rigor, because the intellectual curiosity for me sort of resonates in, I have a real openness to learn, but it's directed in some way. I want to dig into it and really, that's sometimes I think you don't need the intellectual part. You just go to the curiosity piece, right? But in a world that is really dynamic, and they talked about, it's very well discussed, the Microsoft culture shift from the last CEO to the current one, who I admire very much, was from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of energy you're bringing. But you've talked a couple times about wonder and rigor,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't want to also miss, and I'll get to it later, that idea of the creativity leap, which was the name of your first book. But what does wonder and rigor mean? Because there is so much dynamic tension inherent in that pairing, but it's sort of a beautiful pairing. And the first time I heard it from you, I it really captured my imagination.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I was The way I got to Wonder and Rigor was actually I was doing what I call a miniature ethnography. I was really interested in the question of who are the professionals who rely on their intuition. I sometimes call it pattern recognition in order to get stuff done. And my assumption, my hypothesis was I think that first responders
Mm.
really rely on their intuition. I'm going to assume that chefs are really good at pattern recognition and the speedy rush work that they're charged to do. And I'm going to assume that I think that choreographers, dancers are also really good at pattern recognition and intuition. So that was actually what I was focused on. And I'm in Philadelphia. I actually happen to be from Philly. One of my favorite dance companies, there's two. One is Philadenko, the other is Ballet X. I was observing a rehearsal of Ballet X, and there's incredible amounts of wonder that is part of any artistry to even have this very exploratory stance. If you talk to artists about their work in progress, they are so comfortable when you ask them, what are you working on? Where is this headed? And they'll say, I don't really know. They're very open to the process. So there was that part, that intuitive nudge that, especially in postmodern ballet groups, there is a very collaborative process between the choreographer and the dancers. But then I was noticing, and so that kind of is obviously the wonder dimension. But there's clearly so much discipline and
Hmm.
practice and focus and time on task that's also a critical dimension of that creative artistic process. And so that observation of those rehearsals was the beginning point for me to play around with, as you rightly call it, this tension that is the creative process. So many times when people think about creative, and if they say, well, I'm not a creative type, again, air quotes, because I can't sing, dance, draw, sculpt, etc., they're also thinking that creativity is, they're assuming that creativity is doing whatever I feel like, as if it's pulling something randomly out of your armpit, which it's not at all. Right? There's so much drudgery of staring at the blank page, the blank slate, of kind of going back to the same point over and over again. It's the rigor, the focus, the discipline, the skill mastery, the time on task that's also so essential. We see this in athletics as well, right? So
Hmm.
the best athletes spent not just years, decades honing their skill, their craft, so that they can really go out there and play, capital P, play in the most experimental, improvisational, creative ways. They have both the wonder and the rigor. And I'll just kind of culminate this part of our conversation by saying that I've always loved the way the great American dancer and choreographer Twyla Tharp
Hmm.
has talked about how before you can think out of the box, you must start with a box, which I love because so many times in corporate America, we hear, we got to think out of the box, people. You do, but you got to know the rules. You got to have mastery so that you can extend them, stretch them, rebound against them. We need both.
Reminds me of what you were saying about you have to know the question you're asking too. Sometimes that question is the box. What box are we even in right now?
Yeah, absolutely. The question is the box. The question is the boundary. Coming
Hmm.
up with the right question is the rigor, right?
Yeah.
It's so hard to do sometimes. Absolutely.
And we're back to jazz, by the way. Everything you said
Great.
obviously applies to jazz, which was your original analogy. You're reminding me very much of that tension with folks who sit in the creative capital C department. And I've had the pleasure of working with creative team members across all disciplines for years. And at our agency, we have a digital team and paid media and project management, and our communications professionals. It's a really diverse, integrated group. But one thing I've always noticed with those who are in the official creative department, especially those who are artists and production designers, all kinds of folks, motion graphics, video, it's very hard for those type A folks like myself, I've been one of them, who are on sort of the comm side when there's a creative assignment given, that tension of when will it fit on this timeline? And one of the things that I've had to talk about being a whisperer between teams, I've tried to, my goal, I feel, is to create understanding between different lenses and perspectives, and
Hmm.
depending on where people are seated. I've had to say to folks, the creative teams have to work on a timeline, and they know that's we're in a career, in a professional business setting, a client service setting. But I've had to say to folks who don't have that job, they don't know how long it'll take right now. They're on the blank page. They're on the blank slide. They're on the blank canvas, literally, metaphorically, and literally the blank canvas. Soon they will have to know. And if they don't, they'll have to bring in reinforcements, because sometimes you need that. And AI, by the way, can start to be those creative reinforcements to spark
Absolutely.
us. But
Yes.
you're reminding me a lot about that moment of like translating between like what is it you need to unleash that creativity. And sometimes it's the rigor of sitting through that hard part.
Well, you grabbed the word that was at the tip of my tongue, which is translation. You are a
Mm,
translator, and when you're in that role, that intermediary role of it's so much of our work as leaders is to do these acts of translation,
yeah.
which means that you have to be incredibly hybrid, incredibly nimble, incredibly curious yourself.
Mm,
The other uh, constraint that is always there to help any kind of creative process is the deadline.
yeah.
At a certain point, it's got to be over. It's got to be done. And that's okay because I think for anyone who's engaged in an effort of building a brand, of figuring out a new financial model, of figuring out how to enter a new market, of figuring out how to design a new fill in the blank, there it's never going to be done. And
Yeah.
as soon as you make peace with yourself about that ambiguity, it's okay. This is a version of it. And then to be able to move on is super important.
Well, we see that. I was just watching that show, Truman, about Truman Capote and the Swans,
Oh,
that's
I
on
haven't
now,
started
right?
it
Which is
yet.
an old
Looks so
school.
good.
It's a long time story, but it's now a miniseries. But it talked about Capote's sort of never finishing that second book, and it was him being caught in that moment. And the translation into the corporate setting or any really organizational setting is when the perfect becomes the enemy of the done, meaning that
That's right.
the perfect is the somehow this twisted platonic ideal of the thing that you have in your head, but you can't get there, and we're all guilty of that. We all get stuck in that. And I think these kinds of frameworks of something, even words that are as evocative as wonder and rigor, to say we have to move between them, that's, I think, a powerful way just to help people shift the lens and say, how do I approach this differently? I mean, let's go back to the capital B word, brainstorm, because creativity, the locus of creativity often is either in the department where people are labeled creative, and those are amazing professionals and they work very, very hard, right? Or then we're going to be creative now because we're going to have a brainstorm. And my one of my mentors, Ralph Katz, was a trained facilitator and had brainstorm rules and was very disciplined, a lot of rigor about what did you actually have to bring to a brainstorm to generate something. And unfortunately, no surprise, world, like here's a revelation, many of them don't work well. What's your diagnosis of what's happening in those moments where we're supposed to be gathering for creativity and yet somehow there it's not working?
Well, I think that brainstorming is okay as long as we don't constrict and restrict that moment to the only time when it could be
Yeah.
happening. There needs to be some sort of metaphorical parking lot that a company, an organization, a team always has available, whether or not it's a devoted space on a whiteboard where people
Mm.
can continue to share ideas. Whether it's Slack, whether you're going to use some kind of technological tool, but to understand that the brainstorming session is a phase of it. And
Mm.
ideally, brainstorming is juicier when you can brainstorm and ideate with people who come from a different department, who don't arrive with the same questions, conundrums, who will challenge your assumptions. So, someone who I reference frequently in my keynotes is Jerry Hirschberg, who
Mm.
used to be the head of design at Nissan. And Jerry used to always require his design teams to bring in people from finance, HR, or manufacturing or sales. Didn't really matter, but a range of people to help contribute to the process. And at first, for everyone, there's hands on the hips. None of us, when we're really honest, likes to collaborate because we think, oh my gosh, we can do this so much faster by ourselves. They do not understand what we do, et cetera, et cetera. But the good part of these kind of collaboration processes that Jerry Hirschberg set up was that he was inviting in cognitive diversity, and
Mm.
he began to call this creative abrasion. He
Mm.
understood that the people would abrade against this sort of collaboration, that it would cause friction. And what he understood is that what friction yields at the end of the day is energy. So why not convert that energy into something positive? So I love that your friend and colleague Katz talks about bringing all sorts of restrictions and framing things,
Mhm.
and narrowing in the focus. It does no one any good to say, okay, this is the topic, let's just brainstorm. You got to have an interesting question prompt, or give it. I have all sorts of frameworks and parameters that I like to
Yeah.
bring in to help people winnow in on the brainstorming process. And one of those other sparks is bringing people from totally different departments to kind of gaze on the same problem that you're gazing on.
I just think that's so magnificent because, frankly, one of the things I'm most concerned about in any organization, mine, my clients, et cetera, is breaking down silos, disrupting us versus them thinking, which, by the way, can also disrupt things like implicit bias. It can disrupt a whole bunch of files that you're running without being aware that it's like background files running on a computer. And the fact of like coming together in that kind of way is very, very powerful.
Yes.
And I love the idea of a divergent thinking. I mean, let me go right to the question. It's an age old question, Natalie. It's a question you've heard a million times. So let's address it here. Is everyone creative? And how do we even answer that question?
My perspective is that everyone is creative, that to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. The distinction comes
Mhm.
in terms of whether or not you are committing to the process of building your creative capacity. So
Mm,
even artists, professional artists, whatever their genre of art, will admit there are ebbs and flows in their creative capacity. There has to be a commitment. My words, my perspective is to wonder and rigor. So, how do you spark the wonder? Wonder can happen by reading more fiction. Wonder can happen through travel. And I don't mean you need to invest a big budget and go on a plane and goes to some far off place. I wrote an article for the platform She Media about micro retreats and what you can
mm,
do a walking retreat. You can go to a neighborhood in your town or city that you rarely go to and be an anthropologist for the day. I recently spoke for Westfield Insurance in Cleveland, Ohio, and got there a day early and was able to visit an incredible art exhibit by, I believe the artist's name is Louise May, who dried over 50,000 flowers. And it was an installation in the Grand Hall of the Cleveland Library. And it was an afternoon of awe and wonder. First of all, who would do something like that? And then my next question was, why not do something like that? It was just amazing. She gathered all these flowers from the area. But so travel, reading fiction, becoming a clumsy student of anything is also
yeah.
another way to spark wonder. Becoming a clumsy student of anything is also a way to spark rigor. And so rigor comes by, stepping away from the churn of email, giving
Mm.
yourself dedicated quiet time to focus. And I think designing space and time for that really matters for rigor. I think it often helps if there's quiet. It helps if you're committed to repetition, if there's some part of your world and your work that maybe it's like you commit to, rigor can be scaled incrementally. Maybe it's, I'll make sure I read one scholarly article a week. That for me is rigorous, right? To really make sure I'm understanding the
Mhm.
field of XYZ in a certain way. Maybe it's, for me as a writer, it's making sure I get in 15 minutes of just brain dump, getting the words out every single day. And sometimes I find that I have more to write. Sometimes I don't have the budget of time. But it's committing to that toggling between wonder and rigor that actually helps us to build that creative capacity.
One of my partners here at GNS, Brian Hall, who's our president, is in our Chicago office. He's been talking a lot about continuous partial attention as a real challenge for us as humans and as productive workers, employees, colleagues, partners, um, and is also been cultivating an interest in meditation and also how do you carve out that space to have a task. And I know that feeling too, as somebody who has to do a lot of strategic writing and start from a blank page and big picture thinking. It's really uncomfortable to sit yourself down and put the butt in the chair and to get out and think about it. But I personally really resonate with the idea of like, I think from my past, maybe in college and such, I was like, I'll write it the night before and it'll be great, right? And the older you get, the more that I need to marinate, and I see those processes of sleep or being with it and moving away from it, and being back with it and moving away from it. So it's that iteration, repetition, sometimes going back over the first few slides over and over again or reworking them, then the rest of them come much faster. So I really resonate with some of those concepts that you're sharing.
What is
Yeah.
that phrase? I love that. Continuing
Continuous
partial.
partial attention. Yeah,
That's awesome.
it's it's been discussed a lot in different names, but the idea that we're constantly being pulled away, every little ding, every little alert, every little social media post, the constant checking of emails. So it's the interruption of flow. And it's also the myth of multitasking. I think some brains multitask more fluidly than others. It's just talking about neurodivergence. We're all quite different, cognitive
Hmm.
diversity. But there's something about when is it that you let the brain run more free, that wonder piece, and explore new things, and when is it that you need to bring it into some guardrails and some guidance. So I find that. What is for you the creativity leap? I know that you named the book that, and it's probably many of the things you're talking about, but where did that title come from for you?
It actually came from a brainstorming session with my editor at Barrett Kohler, where we were trying to figure out a way to capture the ideas in the book. And
Mm,
the idea, the Cliff Notes version of the book, is that creativity is not a nice to have, it's a must have, right?
mm,
And I originally wanted to call the book The Creativity Gap.
mm,
And Neil Malett, who was my editor, and he's the VP of editorial at Barrett Kohler, he said, he was kind of kindly and politely listening to me going on about just,
yeah.
spitballing and stuff. And he finally said, I totally get what you mean by creativity gap, because my point was that there's this chasm that we need to bridge between um, the uncertainty that we feel and then needing to engage in really experimental creative work and acts, especially now more than ever. He said, but my experience shows that a lot of time in publishing, when a book title has a negative word, it doesn't
Mm,
do as well. It's
mm,
like, really? He said, yeah, and something about the word gap, it kind of connotes something negative. So we kind of just went to our thesaurus. And by the way, my new favorite app ever is, if you don't know it, is Word Hippo. Love it because it's just an incredible app for, it's a thesaurus, it's an online thesaurus. It's brilliant. But landed on Leap. And the reason I ended up loving it is because, I mean, the first page of the book, I talk about what is a leap, what's required to leap. It requires vision. It requires the need to identify some sort of barrier that you can't just walk around or step over. It requires this kinesthetic, energizing effort. And so the word leap is absolutely visual, and it really ties into the effort that real commitment to creative work requires. The imagination, the vision, the all of the activity that is so diverse that helps us to get not just from point A to B, but from point A to X, right?
mm.
And my background in dance also made me have a lot of affinity for the word leap.
I like it because it's so embodied, that kinesthetic feeling, that you mentioned, that the sense that it's like a whole body physical experience to do.
Correct.
So it's not just mental work.
Not
How
at
do we
all.
throw our, I'm very much about, I really am enthusiastic about so many things I love to learn. And I really look for others who want to embody things fully and bring their full self to it and all their energy to it. So I think that's a wonderful title. Well, I've kept you a long time. I mean, you've shared a little bit about this already, but for our listeners out there, I always think of my audience as first and foremost my colleagues at GNS, but then all my clients and others out there, whoever might discover this, right? What are some of the things, and we talk about building brand gravity, which is about attracting, stakeholders into an orbit of an idea or a brand or a person or a company. How do you feel we as individuals and organizations can cultivate creative practices that are more compelling for ourselves? What are one or two final thoughts you'd leave with us as things for people to stew over?
I think just to build on one of the last things you just said, and that it's not a purely mental exercise,
Hmm.
this idea of having interoception and perioception, of being aware of
Mm,
where we are in space, of being where we are in our bodies. I'll just share a quick fun
yeah.
fact from what I've learned about, for example, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the
Mm,
longest cranial nerve in our body. It extends from the brain down through the heart into the gut. And it's there's something called interoception that we all do. Interoception is that inner awareness. I'm tired, I feel safe, I feel scared, I need to use the restroom, etc. And interoception, that inner awareness, is actually powered by the vagus nerve. It's this internal antenna and sense making. And the vagus nerve is actually also attached to intuition. So when we say things like, my gut is telling me, it literally is, because of the way the vagus nerve is designed in our body. So the fun fact I learned is that scientists have recently learned that something called interoceptive awareness, which the experiment they did was to test people who were able to tap out their heartbeat, not by feeling the pulse in their wrist, but just by sitting still, hands on their lap, and literally being able to discern their beating heart. They did it, for example, for a married couple. The woman could not do it at all. The husband was like, this is so easy. You can't do this. He was so aware of the beating of his heart. And the scientific research shows a direct connection between interoceptive awareness, all those little subtle, quiet
Mm-hmm.
things that are happening internally, and rational cognition and rational decision making. And I
Mm.
love that this research study, because it shows that the connection between the intuitive and the rational and the cognitive is not a fuzzy dotted line, and it's not woo woo. There's actually a direct connection between that self-awareness and tapping into that self-awareness and being able to have greater cognition and be better at strategic decision making. So how might we get better at that? I'll go to something I referenced a few minutes ago, was we should all engage in being clumsy students of
Mm.
anything. And you know that for me, it's dance, it's
Yep.
hip hop dance, it's ballroom. When I'm a clumsy student, I am full of so much wonder, and I have to commit to the rigor of knowing the darn steps, learning the choreography, practice making mistakes over and over and over, learning from my fellow students, learning from a range of teachers. I bring that new way of thinking, that confidence with asking questions, with following my gut, with being more experimental into the work at hand. So firing up those neural synapses as clumsy students in our pastimes absolutely will help us in the work at hand. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about and writing about in my next book. It's absolutely that the
Mm-hmm.
work that we do when we step away from the desk, the activity I should say that we do when we step away from the desk, is really essential for the actual output of productivity.
I think that's amazing. That's a wonderful place to end because I do think this resonates so much with the world we're living in today and some of the challenges that we're facing. So, Natalie Nixon, Figure Eight Thinking, I'm so glad you could join me today. It's always fun when we can connect. And I encourage folks, follow us where you get your podcast, check us out, and I always welcome comments. So, Natalie, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Anne. This was awesome.